Kimberly here. This is Macabish, Cults, Classics, and Horrors. We're talking films, series, books, and life, and we're starting right now.
Well, here's where I feel like if I were really good at giving interviews, I would invent a really interesting backstory for myself. But I feel like it's still kind of inspirational for some people in the sense that the path to becoming a best-selling author, I do not have an English degree. I never worked in publishing. I have no connections in publishing. I don't know any editors or agents. I didn't live in New York. All of the stuff I saw on TV as a kid that involved becoming an author, I didn't do any of that. Remember, when I first started writing, like just in a notebook for myself as a teenager, the internet did not exist and had not been conceptualized. Like the concept of you type it in a box and it goes out to the world, that was not a thing. And as far as I knew, would never be a thing. So the question people ask is like, well, growing up, did you want to be an author? It's like, well, growing up, I was living in a town of 5,000 people with 3 stoplights and 2 restaurants. And there are no bookstores. The only books I had available to me were the paperbacks I could get at the pharmacy. And there was like there's like one shop that sold like candy and stuff. And they had a little shelf of comic books and that kind of thing. And that was it. So everything I would love to say about how I grew up in the classics or, aspiring to read the great authors or wanting to be H.P. Lovecraft. I didn't have access to H.P. Lovecraft. Maybe they had them at the library, but I didn't go to the library. That was something nerds did. So if for the kids out there who feel like their future is aimless or feel like the job they would like to do doesn't exist, please remember, I graduated high school in 1993. When I entered the adult world, when I left my public education, the internet still did not really exist. As in 1993, there was a few extremely, high-tech tech nerds doing this thing called the internet, but the World Wide Web as we know it now was still not a thing.
It's true.
So the job that would come to define my life did not exist. The technology did not exist. So that's why I try to tell the story as honestly as I can, because there are kids out there who are 16, 17, 18, 35, 37 who don't know what they're going to do when they grow up. But it's like, hey, it may be the thing you were built to do doesn't exist yet, and it may come along. So like true. in my case, I started blogging in 1997, 98, something like that, when I got my very first dial-up internet connection. And it was before the word blog existed. That word, it's not just before social media. It's not just before Instagram. It was before you could do video online because the bandwidth wasn't there. So long before YouTube, before Facebook, no one knew the term social networking, and no one knew the term blog, which is the thing that came before social networks. Right. And so I started typing. It's like, oh my gosh, these words that you can just type anything and people have to look at it like.
Right.
And it was like, wow. So all of these gatekeepy things that I thought were going to keep me from ever writing for an audience, because the idea of like how you get from small town to being the writers you see in the movies, like in the movie Misery, where he goes to like New York and he's in a New York apartment, like a penthouse, and he talks in person to his agent and goes to these cocktail parties, these launch parties in New York. Like, how do you get from rural Illinois to that? And the answer is you don't. There's no pathway. So the idea of being a writer on that level, it was in this, I dreamed of it in the sense that little kids will dream of being an astronaut. Like those kids are not thinking in terms of, well, I can join the Air Force and become a test pilot and become an officer. They just have this dream of being in space. Well, it's the same thing. There was no concept of, so I went to college and went into journalism because I thought, well, that will at least let me write things for people. But that industry was already dying by the time I graduated. But meanwhile, I was just writing stuff as an amateur online and slowly building an audience because I was extremely fortunate. As much as I thought of myself as being unfortunate for being born what seemed like 1,000 miles away from the action, I got in on the ground floor of the internet. I was blogging in the late 90s when 60 or 70% of the population still didn't have their own connection at home, internet connection.
Right.
So in that sense, I was extremely lucky. So the book that would eventually make my career as an author was a story that I started posting in the early 2000s. And every year at Halloween, I'd post a little more of it. And it was just, I posted it for free. And it went, back then, we would say it went viral. It started to get its own following, but it was just there on my blog. It was like, my blog was just whatever I felt like writing, silly movie reviews, essays, whatever, that at Halloween, I would switch over and write on this fiction story. And it gained a little bit of a following. But again, even then, the idea of someone writing on the internet getting a book deal, that had never happened. Like it literally had not happened yet. Whereas now, if you have like a successful Twitter account, from that you can get a book deal because all they care about is, do you have an online presence to sell books? Back then, there was still no pathway. There was like no respect for people writing online because why should there be? You might be 10 years old for all they know. It was all anonymous. It was all just text. So why would they hand a book deal to somebody like me?
Right.
So I wasn't doing this like, okay, I've got a strategy. I'm going to write this on the internet, and then I will do this and this and this, and then boom, I'll be a famous author and be able to do it full time. That thought never entered my head because again, that wasn't an existing career path.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened was people would send me, after about 5 years of this, I had a novel length story. And then as I went, it was great because the great thing about writing on the internet is if you want to change something you've already written, you can just open up the CMS and go right in there and change it. So I could write the payoff for something and then go back and drop it in foreshadowing. And if you read it now, it's like, oh, he's a genius. He set this all up in advance. It's like, well, no, I actually came up with the other part. And I went and edited it back in because I've given away for free. What are you going to do? Complain? It's so it was this living document. And then after I had a full novel length thing, even then it's just like, okay, well, I guess I'll just keep writing stuff. And I keep writing additional editions of it, but there still wasn't like, okay, this is my meal ticket. And so what happened was somewhere around 2005, 2006, people were sending me photos where they had printed out my book and put it in like a 3-ring binder so they could read it like a book. I'm like, look, I made a book. Nice. And so I was like, well, this is idiotic. So I went to Cafe Press at the time. Maybe they still do. They used to have a thing where you could upload a PDF and a cover image, and you could sell print on demand. People could get a physical copy of your book that way.
Right.
Just riddled with typos, no formatting, but it was an actual physical copy people could hold in their hands. And then I just sold it at cost because they were very expensive, which makes sense. They're having to print it. It's like making a meal from scratch every time a customer walks in. Like that's a very expensive way to do it, but it's also a miracle. I was so proud, but you couldn't like order it at Amazon or go to a bookstore and get it. You could only get it from Cafe Press. But my thinking was, well, it's better than people trying to read it off a binder and having to print it out. Like the cost of the inkjet cartridges you're going to use is about the same.
Oh, yeah.
And so sold a few hundred copies that way. And then a small like print on demand publisher called Permuted Press came along, and they offered me actually an advance of a few $100s, which I thought was insane, to do it as a proper, they would put a copy editor on it, get a better cover on it, and then it would have an ISBN number. So it would actually be on Amazon and libraries. If bookstores wanted to order it, they could, they could order it. So that was a big step up, but it was still there was none of the things you associate with a big publisher in terms of there being a publicity campaign or having relations with, or like foreign rights or an audiobook or having relations with the bookstore chains where you can get them to order 3,000 copies of it. There was none of that, but it's still to, me and my family and everybody else, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm a published author.
It's a miracle.
So
Amazing.
this wound up on the shelves of some Barnes and Noble stores, and people were showing me pictures like, oh, they've got a copy of your book for some reason. And I sold like, I think about 3,000 copies that way, which meant I made, you're only making like 10% of the cover price. So I don't know. I made several $100s off of it, which again, I thought that was the most people that would ever read a book I had written. And I thought that was a miraculous number considering the disadvantages it had, not knowing that when you go into a Barnes and Noble, almost all of those books on the shelf you see only sold a few thousand copies.
Right.
Like I didn't realize that's how publishing worked. I still thought, oh, this is a guerrilla campaign. And then by extreme long odds, so like the sales of that started to taper off to where I was selling like 4 or 5 copies a week. I thought, well, okay, that's the end of that. Like I've had my moment in the sun as an author. I will go back to my life as a blogger. Again, my job during the day at this point, I was working in a cubicle at an insurance company doing data entry. It wasn't copywriting. It wasn't anything creative. It was a job I got through a temp agency, and then they hired me on. I think I was making like $9.50 an hour. So this whole time, like my day, I'm just a guy who bounces around to office jobs, going through temp work. I had gotten a journalism degree. I'd worked in journalism for about 1.5 years at a local TV station and dropped out of it. And I hated it. And also I was very bad at it. So the idea of still, it was just, at this point, I'm in my early 30s. I was born in 1975. So it's like, okay, I've had my fun little thing where I'm still blogging in my spare time, making no money off of it. Because again, writing on the internet has just never been profitable under any model. And it's like, I've had my brief moment where I can tell people, oh, actually I wrote a book, that came out. It's actually on some shelves. Like, oh yeah, what's it called? And it'd be a fun little anecdote I can tell, but sales have dropped off. Nobody cares about it. I'm not making any money off my website. And it's like, I'm 31 years old or 30 years old at this point. I have to leave this writing stuff behind and go train for some sort of a real job. And so I started, I took classes at a local community college and databases and Microsoft Access and tried to learn some basic programming, trying to see if I had any kind of an aptitude for that kind of thing. Because it was obvious at that point, that's what the future was, learning how to do networking, all of that stuff. They were constantly hiring in that, but it was obvious the writing thing hadn't worked out. In 2007, I get an email from Don Coscarelli, who was a horror writer, producer, director. He made the Phantasm movies. He had just made Bubba Hotep, which was a horror buddy comedy, asking if he could, did I have an agent? He wanted to get the film rights to this book I'd written, John Dies at the End. That he had somehow, against incredible long odds, gotten a copy of. Because again, only a few thousand copies exist. That one of the people who would have it would be someone who had the power to get a film made was ludicrous. I didn't answer the email. I thought it was a phishing hoax. So he persisted in emailing me and eventually dug up a phone number at some point and asked if he could talk to me on the phone, and says, I want to buy the rights to this. And I want to make it. It's like right in my wheelhouse. It's because the tone's very similar to Bubba Hotep. It's similar to what he does. It's got like a mind-blowing twist that you can put in there. And we talked about it. And again, at the time, I had no agent. I had to call around. Like I went on the internet and tried to Google names of attorneys that had done entertainment law or book contracts or anything. I certainly wasn't going to ask to get a literary agent, because it's like I'm not I'm not a writer. I work at an insurance company. The thing I said to the lawyer, I left it on his voicemail. I was like, I've already have a deal getting done. I just need you to look over the paperwork and make sure that it's all boilerplate, that I'm not accidentally giving away any rights that you wouldn't expect.
Right.
So went back and forth on that. It took a few months. People always ask, well, how much did he pay for the rights? And it's like, do you understand how irrelevant that is?
Right.
Because if he had called me and said, hey, I'm going to make this into a movie, the only thing is I need you to pay me $5,000 to help get it made, I would have went out and borrowed the money, because you've won the lottery as a writer when a book gets turned into a movie. You just have.
Right.
As I was about to find out. Because again, it's not the way lots of writers have sold the rights and film and TV rights to stories. But the typical thing that happens is it goes into a pile of
Right.
scripts and story ideas of properties, and stuff will sit for 20 years before maybe somebody will try to make a show out of it. And then maybe that pilot doesn't get picked up, or they'll try to make a movie and then it dies in development. Here was someone saying, no, this is going to be my next project. Because he had originally been doing a sequel to Bubba Hotep. I think there was some issues with like actor availability, that kind of thing. He's like, no, I want to do this. It's not that I want to acquire the rights and just have it among the pile of stuff on my desk. I want to make it. So
Amazing.
we got that done. And then about 3 weeks later, I get a call from crack.com, a comedy website startup, offering me a job as a writer, editor there, working from home, making twice what I was making at my office job. So at the moment I had given up on writing, there was a span, it was a 3-week span where the film rights to John Dice at the End got sold. And then I got a call saying, or an email saying, hey, we want you to come interview for the editor spot at this new comedy website we're starting. And that was that. Like, I've been a full-time writer ever since. And prior to that point, I had never been published in any capacity. I had never sold a piece of, like, an article to a magazine. Again, I had attempted to sell a book idea to an agent that it went nowhere. There was like one brief conversation that it was dismissed. I had never done anything. To this day, I've never written a query letter. I actually don't know what that is. I've never had to shop for agents or pitch to editors. I've never pitched a book before. Because once I sold the film rights, I immediately got like the news went out in the trades, and then immediately got contacted by a division of Macmillan. It's St. Martin's Press division, Macmillan, one of the 3 publishers that still exist, saying we want to pick up the rights to John Dice and do it in a hardcover, full-blown hardcover run. St. Martin's had to buy the rights from the book from Permuted Press, and then they separately looped me in on the deal. Like, they paid both of us. Kind of an unusual situation, but it was an unusual path to publication, where I went from self-publishing to print on demand to now a full hardcover book deal with one of the mega publishers. But we worked it out so that because they wanted to keep me in the loop, because they wanted to do another round of editing and write a new afterword, and basically have me involved to write future books. So the book gets released in hardcover in 2009. It earned back its advance in 7 days, and became an instant hit. At the time, I was writing a sequel. The title would be "This Book is Full of Spiders. Seriously, dude, don't touch it." At the time, that book would come out right around when the film was getting done, because in the meantime, the film would wind up coming out in 2012. So it was a 5-year process. And again, that's the way it works in film. You just don't, he acquired the rights, and then I just heard nothing for 2 years. And then I hear out of the blue, and I assumed, oh, well, they've dropped it or whatever. Because again, I have enough friends who are writers to know that the phrase they use is that in Hollywood, nothing gets made. You get tons of meetings, tons of people saying yes, but no shows ever get picked up. No movie, like for every one thing that actually winds up on your screen, 10,000 projects got started and died. So I thought, oh, well, he's moved on to make something else, or some other project came along, or maybe that maybe Bruce Campbell got freed up and they wanted to do another thing together, whatever. And I had accepted it. And then he contacts me and says, "Hey, we've got Paul Giamatti on board as a producer. We got a cast together. Like we're like doing readings for the roles of John and Dave. We want to cast unknowns, blah, blah, blah." And like they're picking out locations. Like, this is happening. So the way it happened was the film debuted at Sundance in January 2012. They had me come out there. I flew out there, did publicity with the cast, did like an onstage Q&A at the screening they insisted on bringing me along to all that stuff. And then the second book came out right at the height of the publicity around the film. And This Book is Full of Spiders is the one that made the New York Times bestseller list.
Oh, perfect.
And that was that. So I continued to work at Cranked until 2020. I quit right before the pandemic, and I'm writing books full time now. But that's how many years I put in before being able to do it as my only source of income. So I worked at Cracked for 13 years. But if you go back and do the math from when I started blogging, 1997, 98 till 2020, I basically wrote as a side job for, 22 years. That's how much time I put in writing, and the amount of unpaid work I did just for exposure, I guess you would say these days, it's thousands of pieces. And that's how much free work I had to pour into the system before I would be allowed to do it the way I do it now, where I write a novel and get paid well and can pay a mortgage with it, and etc.
It's amazing.
But so the book I'm promoting here is the fourth book in that John Dies DN series, but they're not serialized. You can jump in anywhere. They're episodic. So if there are any listeners, I know that if somebody turns you on to like a fantasy series and they're like, "Oh yeah, there's 26 books for you to catch up on." That's a lot to ask. In this case, I'd be asking you to read 3 books. You can come in on book 4. It's fine. You will be confused, but reading the other books will not lessen your confusion, and in fact, will probably make it worse.
Right.
That's the nature. You'll see what I mean when you read them. That's the nature of the stories. The main characters, at no point do they actually know what's going on. That's part of the charm.
Well, that's what I love about the serialized type of books, is that you can just jump in on the newest popular one that everybody's talking about, and then you can go back and still keep up and everything, right?
Yeah, and again, there you do lose some things. Like if somebody reads book 4 and they go back and they're like, "I'm going to start with book 1," and they notice there's a beloved character that was not in book 4, maybe don't get too attached to that character.
Right.
They do still occur in linear time, and so you'll notice there's a character missing from this, or vice versa. Like, well, they obviously were introduced later, but it's not a Song of Ice and Fire situation where we end on a cliffhanger and then, for all you know, I'll just never write the next book. It's not. Each book is a beginning, middle, and end of its own. It's episodic. It's on purpose. I want people to be able to jump in anywhere, and then so that you hopefully you will be thrilled at the prospect of reading the first 3, but I don't want it to be a requirement, mainly because I would find that so stressful.
Right.
The thought of sending a book out into the world, not knowing how I'm going to resolve the stuff I just set up. I'm not criticizing that type of writing. I can't even fathom writing something like George R.R. Martin has done, or any of the great fantasy authors. I can't imagine it. It doesn't, for me, each one has to wrap itself up completely in order for me to be at ease. Otherwise, I would just worry myself to death. Like, well, what if I don't resolve this in a satisfactory manner? There's especially if you're going years between editions, and I think fans are you have these rabid fans discussing among themselves, speculating about what's going to happen. So I think it would just tear myself apart.
Like horror fans do, because that's all we do. We're chomping at the bit, and then if the next one comes out and it has nothing to do with the last one, like if we're not told, riots in the streets, the internet streets, riots. It would be ridiculous because that's what we do because we get excited about it.
Yeah,
But
and that's a way fans express their love for something. Like when
right,
people get mad, they get so angry about how the Game of Thrones TV show ended. Like, obviously, I'm not supporting the idiots, the ones who like sent death threats and stuff to the film runner, the showrunners. I'm not supporting that. I'm saying that people who go over the top and how mad they are that it wasn't adapted properly. It's like, well, it's because they love it.
right,
They're disappointed because they love it. They're not just being jerks. The worst thing that could happen is if they just didn't watch or they didn't care. It's like, I would rather have people care in a way that's abrasive or weird than to just be ignored, because the vast majority of things that have ever been created artistically were just ignored. Like that's the most common fate. If people are talking about you, good or bad, again, unless they're sending death threats to your house, that's a whole separate thing. That's
right.
the crazies doing that. But if they're like people, posting memes about how bad the last book was, I will take that over being ignored any day of the week.
Right. That makes sense. I don't know how you're just writing book after book after book, like craziest stories. I love them. But I'm going to tell you something. When you left Cracked, I was inconsolable because every day I would wake up, turn on the computer, go to Cracked. And I was like, what am I going to do with my mornings while I get like inconsolable for years, decades. That was the first thing I did. Well, let's see what he's going to write today. That's how I started my day. And then it's like, oh, well, I'll just start reading his books. And it was one book after another. You don't know the level of joy. I read them and then I just start all over again. My entire adult life. Apparently, I've been following you around the internet. I can honestly say one of the things that has been a constant in my adult life is reading what you write. My whole adult life.
That means so much to me. And this is why when people are most curious about like the money side of things or how much something sold or whatever. And it's like, because I keep talking about how I wrote so much of it for free over the years, because again, when it was being posted on the internet, I wasn't charging for it. It was just out there, and people would talk like you're throwing your effort into the void. And it's like, no, I hear from these fans. I hear from people who wanted to read something like this but didn't know it until they saw it. Right. It's like, it means something to people. We had a message board at my old blog and then it continued when I got hired at Crank. We brought it over. I think in the time that message board has been around, something like 12 different married couples met each other on those boards and got married.
Yeah.
It's like, it means something. And I think that's what I can tell a story of what happened at Cranked, because it's exactly like the nature of the internet as it is now versus it as it was in the blog era, when people used to follow like good writing, long form writing, and people would actually and I think these days a lot of that is migrated to YouTube, because there's some wonderful like film essayists on YouTube, and they'll put out these great hour-long loving reviews going into detail about film. I think that's kind of where what the people who would have been star bloggers back in the early 2000s, now they're YouTubers. That's all fine. It's just that I got hired at Cracked, and the people who had never went to cracked.com. It was a website, because it used to be a humor magazine that started in the 1950s. It was a Mad magazine ripoff.
Right.
It's like these corny parody stuff. And so what had happened was that magazine folded in the mid 2000s, and then somebody bought it and tried to resurrect it as like a more modern, like a glossy Maxim type magazine, but it's still called Cracked. And it just didn't work, because Cracked, the magazine, was aimed at like 12-year-old kids. And they were trying to aim it at a more lucrative type of magazine customer, right? Like somebody who actually buys things.
Right.
And it folded after like 4 or 5 issues. So what happened was the domain for the website part of the operation just was kind of abandoned, and a company, a tech startup, came along and bought it, because they were buying just hundreds of domains that had existing traffic. So like expired brands and stuff, and then trying to find something they could put there. So they bought crack.com, the domain of the old magazine, and a couple of the members of the writing staff of the magazine stayed on board to try to write some sort of a website. And then they were allowed to hire an assistant editor. And that's where they found me, purely because I happened to be friends with one of the guys who was working there. So I was brought on at the time. It was 2 employees and 1 intern. And there was no office, like we were just working from home, because this giant company was it's like, we need something to put at that domain. So we went about trying to create this brand of comedy that wasn't like, as much as possible, wasn't like bro type, like Babe of the Day slideshow. It was, because we felt like sites like College Humor kind of leaned into that stuff a little bit. It was like aimed specifically at males and kind of like, it was a specific style of comedy. And we wanted to be, if possible, a little bit smarter, kind of a little bit less bitter, if possible. And it just kept growing. So that by the time they would wind up selling Crack in 2016, at that point we had 43 full-time employees, and the site sold for $38 million. And we had at that point a Facebook page with like 4 million fans and a YouTube channel with like 2 million fans and a podcast that was listened to by like, I think 150,000 listeners every episode. Like, we had built it into this multimedia brand up from this thing where it was me and one other guy and an intern, just trying to generate content for this domain. And we just kept growing the traffic and getting more and more attention from the parent company. And they kept throwing more staff at it and doing it. We felt like doing it right, with trying to do smart comedy. It wasn't punching down at people. It wasn't hateful. It wasn't, appealing to the worst in people. It wasn't clickbait. We weren't tricking people into clicking. We weren't doing any of the stuff that you hate about the internet now. It kind of wasn't like that in 2011, 2012. That stuff where the internet would be totally taken over by it, just kind of generated junk, where it's just, you're just carpet bombing the internet with, and again, people who work at a site like Screen Rant, I'm not mad at them. They're just doing a job. But that style of, you're just trying to get to the top of the Google results. Like, you're just mashing the keyboard to get something that will always hit on Google. It wasn't like that back then. You actually grew a following from people bookmarking the site and doing what you did, coming back every day because they wanted to come there.
Right.
But the internet, and this is so strange, and I so few people talk about this, but the internet went from being an entirely PC-based thing that people viewed on a PC to being about 75 or 80% a thing that people viewed on their phone overnight. Like, this happened over the period of a couple of years. Right. And mobile audiences simply behaved differently. And you started to see long form type essay stuff. People with a phone really preferred to get that in the form of a podcast.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, because you can listen to it in your car. Whereas if you try to read an article while driving in your car, the cops get mad. You can listen to it on the treadmill. You can listen to it while you can do the dishes in the kitchen and put your earbuds in and listen to it that way. So if someone wants a funny deep dive into the making of this movie or the crazy story behind this historical figure, these days they're going to get it from a podcast. It's just convenient.
Right.
And then the other weird thing was, in the PC era, people would do what you probably did. They would bookmark a site, and then every morning they would have a list of things they'd bookmarked.
Right.
In the mobile era, people don't bookmark, like you may do it. People don't bookmark websites. It's just not the way they do it, because there's the stupid thing where every website wants their own app. And so your phone is filled with 37. Oh, I've got an app just for USA Today. I've got an app just for. And so what people wanted was one thing they could tap on their phone that would have all their websites on it. So for a lot of people, that's Reddit. Right. They don't go browsing all the newspapers. They go to Reddit and see what people are talking about, or they go to Twitter and see what people are talking about. That's how they keep up with stuff. And at the time in 2012, 13, 14, it was Facebook.
Mm.
And this was where the first tremors of doom were coming, because two companies were totally taking over the internet, Facebook and Google.
Right.
All traffic started to be routed through those two companies. All ad dollars, they refer to this as an internet advertising duopoly. All ad dollars were running through those two companies.
Right.
And it got to the point to where Google could tweak an algorithm, and your article that was getting you 1 million views a month would flip to 0 because they dropped it off the front page, because people don't go that deep into Google results, right?
Right.
So if you'd had an article that SEO'd really well, and they just changed one character deep in their code, you would just watch the traffic drop to 0 just like that. So everything I knew about being a creator, where you're trying to make people happy,
Mm-hmm.
and make them come look at the thing you wrote, was now, it's like, no, it's an algorithm now. So Facebook, all traffic on I still told you we had like 4 million fans on Facebook at one point. That's where everybody was getting their Cracked articles, because they would tap the big blue F on their phone. And if they had friended Cracked at one time, that meant every time we updated, we would post a link on Facebook and they would see it in their feed.
Right.
Well, Facebook got tired of that, because those people were seeing our link, clicking it, and going to Cracked, and those people were not on Facebook anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were looking at our ads, and we were making money, and Facebook's like, no, we want those people to stay on Facebook. So what they did is they flipped a switch and said, none of those 4 million fans will see these links unless you pay us. And the amount you have to pay us is more than what you will make from the traffic.
Right.
And at that point, print internet was dead. This is why today, if you try to Google a term, your first 5 results will be paywalls, or they'll be junk. Like you'll get a great article in the Atlantic or in Washington Post and New York Times, just paywall, paywall, paywall. And then you'll get some spam site where they've just mashed the keyboard for 5 paragraphs to build up the amount. It's like that thing when you're looking for the release date of a movie, and you'll type release date for whatever, Nope Part 2, the next, Jordan Peele's Nope 2, and you'll get the first result will be like Screen Rant, Nope 2, release date, information, what we know so far, and when you go there, it's just gibberish. And at the very, very, very final line, it'll say, there's been no release date or discussion of a Nope 2, but it doesn't matter. They already got your time on site. They got you to look at all those ad units. That is where writing on the internet, like if you want a job writing on the internet, it's that.
Right.
It by choice. It's either that or else the outlet goes broke, or it's three or 4 people with a Patreon, which is where I try to support as many of those things as I can, because that's what's left of being able to make unique stuff for yourself.
That's fascinating. I haven't heard a lot of that stuff. It's interesting to learn.
But yeah, I don't know if the two of you went to Cracked much, but Jason would make these listicles. There was this one, 6 Harsh Truths That Will Make You a Better Person. He released that every year, January 1st. I believe the first year was 2012. He re-released it every year. And the comment section, you would have people who are like, oh, I love this. It'll be one person, I love this. This is great. I needed to read this. The next 30 would be like, who the fuck is this guy? Who does he think he is talking? It was so polar. It was unbelievable. But that article, that year, I read that article every single day. Things like that we need to hear. The comment section was always insane. They would change your perspective just enough so if you were floundering, you could actually like make a decision. Jason, man, he's one of those people, and you knew if you saw David Wong at the top of that Cracked page, you knew the comment section was going to be on fire, and you knew that article was going to be amazing.
I didn't read the comments either, but I wanted like the articles to live as their own thing, because there's something with the internet where if you do like if I sound kind of tired or low energy or whatever, it's because I joined TikTok like 3 weeks ago, and it has drained all of the remaining youthful energy from my soul.
I understand.
So because ultimately there you want to be able to go on and deliver some sort of a message or some sort of a smart observation. And if you weren't going to crack, the whole issue was that at the time there were tons of websites and magazines doing lists, but like BuzzFeed would do 25 gifs of cats getting in trouble.
Right.
So the list it was always considered to be junk content. They're like slideshows,
right.
25, epic fails at construction sites. So we were doing lists where each list item was building to a single point. And we were tricking people into reading 3,000 words on psychology, or we had a guy who was a historian. He was a scholar and loved to do these history deep dives. And it was like 6 myths about the Civil War.
Right.
And again, the comments would be enraged, but the whole point was that it wasn't just, and then there was fun stuff too. So there was like the 6 dumbest Batman villains, things like that. But at each time we would require them at the pitch stage to make some kind of a smart point. That was the whole deal with Cracked. It's like, this is for an educated audience, or for people who just they enjoy, doing a deeper dive into things, which at the time was rare. Now I think that's all over the place.
Right.
But these days, my whole thing in writing under a pseudonym was I completely didn't want anyone to associate the person with the work, because it's like, it's not about me. And these days, especially if it's women on TikTok, and it's a woman there and she's trying to express something hurtful that happened or that happened to her, she's having to put her face out there, her home out there, and the comments will be going into her appearance, her hair, if they don't like her hair. They're always judging, especially, with women authors. I swear to God, TikTok wants to push traffic toward young, conventionally attractive white women authors, which is not their fault. Like they're trying to write the best book they can, but then their comments are like commenting on how pretty they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, it's clear this algorithm, if you're a woman, you have to look a certain way, whereas I can just look like me and nobody cares. But at the same time, it has changed where one time when I came into the internet, everyone was writing anonymously. Like if someone put a real name on their post, it was just assumed it was like a fake name from a movie or something.
Right.
So like I used the name David Wong. David Wong was a character in a screenplay I wrote in high school. And he was a white guy who had used the name David Wong as an alias. And the joke in the screenplay was, it just made it obvious it was an alias. Like it was obvious that wasn't his name, but he did it because he figured that mathematically there's so many people with that surname on Earth that would make him very hard to find, and it had the opposite effect. The character was an idiot. Right. So when I started posting on message boards in 1998, I used the name David Wong as here's how insufferable I was. It was a pop culture reference that only I would get. It was referring to a character in a screenplay that no one else had read except for me and my friends. There's like 4 people on Earth who know what this is. So but that's the way it worked. And I thought, well, I didn't want people to care about me. I wanted them to care about the article, because otherwise, here's what happens. These days, if you go out on YouTube, you go out whatever, and you take some strong stance on something, they won't attack the stance you took. They will examine your video and they talk about, well, you're a feminist because because you're ugly, because no man, like you're mad at men because no man would ever want you, or it's like, and so they will examine the home they're living in. They'll look at the background to see what their bedroom looks like. They're like, well, what are you living in a trailer? It's like, why should I listen to you? You're telling me how to live my life, and you're living in, because at the time I wrote that article that you say, like changed the way you think. I was living in a tiny house that we bought for $31,000 in rural Illinois. Like I was driving a 1994 Ford Ranger that had been gifted to me because I couldn't afford to buy a car of my own. It would have been very easy to say, you can't even afford to get your teeth fixed at the dentist. You're going to tell me how to live my life. And that's the way I feel like it is now, because on these platforms, it's not like it was in the 90s where just your ideas can live separately from you. Now you and your face and your voice have to be out there, and it lets people attack you as a person. And I will admit, I miss when I could just put the work out there under a fake name. And like, I didn't try to create a persona for myself. There was no point where I was claiming to be this person. It was always, this is a pseudonym, this is a username, this is my handle on the message boards. And I didn't talk about myself. People didn't know if I was married. They didn't know where I lived. I didn't put that stuff out there because, again, this was before social media. Right. This was back in an era when it was weird if you did that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the people who like live streamed their entire lives, there's a few famous examples, and they became famous for doing it because, like, what a weird thing to do, to take a camera to a party you're going to and actually filming it and putting it up on the internet. What a weird, like, the Truman Show was about this. It's like this movie, but can you imagine a future where we watch each other's lives over some sort of a screen? Like, weird. Right. You'd have to be such a strange narcissist to think other people care about your birthday party or what you're having for breakfast. And what was totally unthinkable in 2002, I'm hearing a mechanical voice say hello.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was my text message notification. I thought I turned it off.
I thought my headphones were haunted.
No.
So what is common, the way everyone lives now, was considered wild, eccentric behavior back then. So now I mentioned, like, you know who I am because I joined social media, and you can now contact me, and anyone who wants to find me in real life, it would not be difficult for them to show up in my house if they wanted to. I know this because it has happened before. Oh. Strangers have showed up at my front door wanting to meet David Wong. Because now, I've joined TikTok out of necessity, because if you are an author, you need to be on TikTok. If there are any aspiring authors listening to me, I'm telling you, you need to be on TikTok. That's where the people are. That's right. And if you say, well, yeah, but I'm not physically attractive, I don't have like a compelling personality, I get it. I don't know what to tell you. I hate that this is the way it works now. But if it feels to you like the book deals are going to young, very attractive people, there's a reason for that. And it's not that the publisher is saying, attach a headshot to your manuscript so you'll see how pretty you are. It's that they do want to know what your social media platform looks like, because that's how the book will get sold, is on social media. And these days, if you have a social media platform, it means there is something compelling about your real life personality. And that is hard for me to swallow, because if I feel like I'm back in high school, because I was not a popular kid, shockingly. If you observe my amazing conversational skills, that when you ask me a question, I talk for the next 25 minutes uninterrupted. That did not make me popular as a teenager in rural Illinois, believe it or not. I was not the homecoming king. I was not any of that. So to find myself at age 47, and it's high school rules again, that it all comes down to how popular you are, like how charismatic you are, and how many friends you have, and how many people you know in the industry, and how funny you can be, or how compelling you can be on camera. All of that stuff I had to train myself, because you're sitting there watching an algorithm and trying to see watch time and stuff like that, and sitting there thinking, well, Ernest Hemingway never had to do this.
True.
But at the same time, the rebuttal to that would be, the reason you think of Ernest Hemingway as this tough, hunting, hard drinking badass is because he cultivated that image.
True. Yeah.
And maybe he was just as conscious of it as, you look at a picture of Mark Twain, like that hair, that suit, all that stuff, that was cultivated for his public appearances. He invented that appearance for himself.
Yeah, the three of us, we don't show our faces. Well, Carlos does a little bit, but his face is always different. But we don't either. And people tell me all the time, well, if you get in front of the camera, you'll probably have a bigger following. But I know that to get more listeners to the podcast because it's like, okay, then her voice. I'll settle for her voice because I won't do it because it's just gotten crazy.
And it's such an unhealthy dynamic because what they want from you is something you can't give them.
Right.
Like you're not going to be friends. It's hard because you work really hard to make something or to put a product out there. It's like, no, I want to know about you. I want to know what you eat. I want to know what your exercise routine is. I want to know what your wife's name is. I want to know what car you drive. It's like, why? What are you missing from your life? You wouldn't like me if nobody does. You wouldn't like me if you knew me in real life. Mm-hmm. It's like you think you're meeting one of the cool kids. People in real life meet me all the time. They don't want to talk to me a second time. I'm not fun. I'm not fun in groups. I get nervous at parties. I don't know what you're supposed to do. I don't drink alcohol, but it's because for a bunch of reasons. So I don't like being around drunk people. I get a lot of work done because I don't spend any time with friends, but it's so strange because there's all these people that think they want to be my friend. And I can't imagine being a woman. It's so different for me. Like for me, it's a minor annoyance.
Right.
When I see the comments on any woman, she can't win. Because if she's naturally pretty, then the comments are entirely about, oh, no one's watching this for your pottery. They're watching it because you're hot.
Right.
If she's just a normal looking person like me, the average American is overweight. The average American doesn't look like the people on TV. That's just, that's what the real world looks like. If she looks like a normal person you run into at the grocery store, then all the comments are about how hideous and ugly she is. And the videos don't get engagement because if you're a woman, then that has to be part of it. Your pretty face has to be part of the package. And it's like, that's nuts.
Yeah.
That's nuts when you're talking about someone, who is on there to show off their art or their writing or their criticism or anything. And it's just so all the comments are just begging to have some sort of a relationship. It's like, well, why don't we talk just you and me? It's like, for what?
Right.
You live in Japan or you live in London. This person lives in Oklahoma. What do you think you're gonna have? Like, even if you exchange pictures, what do you think you're gonna get out of that? It's go find somebody in real life. Go meet somebody at church or somewhere out in the world. This won't make you happy. It won't.
Right.
I don't have time to give you, and I'm not. If you want to talk to me and you think you're getting like another book out of me that way, like it's like, I'm saying like they see it as like additional content they're getting because they get to talk directly to the author, ask them questions about the book. It's like, no, it's all in the book. If anything I tell you, typing it in an email or in chat or on Discord or in one of the 800 channels people have to talk to me on Twitter DMs, TikTok DMs, Instagram DMs. I'm on all the platforms, Goodreads, private messages. Any of those channels, me discussing the book with you is going to be far less interesting than anything I put into the book because the book took me 2 years to write.
Right.
It's the result of hundreds and hundreds of hours of effort and editing and changes and crafting this thing. And then you want to message me like, well, what did you at the ending? What did she mean by that? And it's like, if I just conversationally tell you that in a Twitter DM, what experience do you think you're gonna get out of it? It's gonna be disappointing. It's not gonna be like this well-crafted thing because my Twitter DMs are not of the same quality of writing as the books that I'm making you pay $30 for.
Well, we could tell you because this part of the reason why we do this podcast because it's an extension of the story. Like we like to watch the movies, read the books. And if I can get the author here, the filmmaker here, it's a continuation. It's an extension of the story. Like the amount of joy we get from doing this, even though it's very casual and we know we're not real friends and we're not a part of your life. It's an extension of the story. And it's like, and we're also collectors. So it's also part of the collection. It's part of that's what it is.
Yeah, and I get that because I have the same impulse. Like when one thing I miss about media is DVD extras commentary tracks.
Oh
I miss that
yeah.
movies don't come with commentary tracks because I love to hear, especially a really good one where they've got like the star and the director and the writer, all three of them. I remember the commentary track for like Fight Club was great, Seven was great, and because you see them out of character, and then you
Mhm.
get an insight into the craft of it.
Right.
That's why when I do these appearances, I try really, really hard not to like tease people with my lifestyle. like, yeah, I'm calling in from my jet ski, uh, but rather to try to get into the process because I want to inspire people to make things, even if they don't get paid for it. Because that's the big thing with writing is that the question I get a lot of, and I'm sure it's the same question that directors get and everybody, YouTubers get. It's like, well, how do you get to where you're making money off this? And I have to tell them, if you want to write, if you love writing, if you get something out of it, the key is to put the idea of ever making money off it out of your mind. Because again, I didn't get started that way. I did not sit down and say, well, there's a lot of money in, horror comedy, because there wasn't at the time. There's no market for that. I sat down and wrote it because I had this story in my head and I wanted to share it with people. And the joy of making a thing, whether it's a book, whether it's a video, whether it's a poem, whether it's a birdhouse that you built,
Right.
or a garden in your lawn, the joy of making it should be its own thing.
Right.
And the joy of taking these characters in your head and letting them live and breathe and bring their story to a satisfactory conclusion or whatever. And if other people enjoy it, that is a treasure. But also, if your entire worth you put on it is in other people paying to see it or giving you the right compliments or whatever, that ultimately will leave you hollow because you can't control that part.
It's true.
All you can control is the thing, how good the thing is and how good you made it. And so when I'm on here, like I try to reemphasize how long I wrote without getting anything out of it in terms of a paycheck. And that's how I got here. Because like, if I had started out from the beginning, like I'm going to write the most commercially successful thing I can, what I would have produced would have been terrible.
Right.
Whereas when I wrote it thinking, okay, maybe 100 of my online friends will see this and this will make them laugh, I accidentally wrote something that made me successful because I wrote it with total abandon.
Right.
It's like, well, who cares what happens? It's like I have nothing at stake. So yeah, that's the thing. And again, I don't want to make my life sound hard, like because I'm having to do a bunch of like interviews and stuff. It's just that I never wanted like my personality to be the selling point, because it's like, well, why would anyone care about you?
Well, because you're a regular person, right? A regular person from a small town, and something amazing happened. And that's like the dream everybody kind of hopes happens to them, right? And it's an amazing thing to watch. And it's usually that's people's story, but they don't tell you the real story, how they came from money and how they know somebody in the industry who put in a good word, and there you go. They leave all that part out and they make it seem like, oh, they just worked really hard, and because they worked really hard and they were in the right place at the right time, it happened. For you, that's real. You were just a regular person in a small town and didn't see how it was ever going to happen, but it happened. That's amazing.
The first time I got paid actual money for writings, I was 32 years old, which again, some people don't understand what I mean by that. I get a lot of messages from people they're like 25 and feel like they've made nothing of their life.
Right.
And it's like, man, it's, like I consider myself, if I had gotten successful right out of school, the way I see some influencers, or whatever, they're 19 and they already have 400,000 followers, I wouldn't have dealt with the success well at all. I think I would have wound up divorced. I would have wound up with probably addictions or something. Like I wouldn't have handled it. I needed to go out into the world and flounder, doing office jobs and stuff for a decade.
Right.
And then when it came along, realize how rare it was, because at that point, again, I knew I had a lot of aspiring author friends. I had many, many friends who had been trying to pitch a book or a screenplay for a decade and going nowhere with it. And knowing that it's rare when these opportunities come along. And I think if it had happened right out of the gate, I would have had a mindset of, oh, this is just what the world is like. I clearly am amazing. You come out, the world recognizes talent, and anybody else who doesn't make it, it must be because they're not trying as hard as I am.
Right.
It's like, no, I was working like a dog that whole time and nobody cared. Like the last thing that happened before I got the job at Cracked was I didn't get a job at a UPS warehouse packing
Right.
boxes onto trucks off the thing, and couldn't even get an interview. I at most places, because my resume was just, again, all this temp office work.
Right.
It's like nobody was sending me, stopping me in the street to tell me I had inspired them. I was just this guy. So when the success came along, I had a little bit more perspective of like, oh, this is all ephemeral. And then, again, I'm not at Cracked anymore. They, in 2017, in December of 2017, they laid off everybody, because
Right.
once Facebook turned off the traffic to the site and Google turned off the rest of the traffic to the site, all of that work, again, this crew of 40 some people that me and the editor in chief, Jack O'Brien, basically handpicked this crew. Like, we talked these people into leaving their previous jobs and coming to work for Cracked. We had built up a name and a reputation where people wanted to come work for us. And so we had that many full-time employees and probably hundreds more contractors and thousands more freelancers. We had this whole army of creators we had brought under the tent and had told ourselves, we're such amazing writers, editors, that's why we're successful. And then one day Facebook just says, no, we're going to change one line in the algorithm, and all of the traffic you get from here will drop it'll drop by 95%, or it's going to vanish. And that was that. The traffic went away and we were dead, because when the traffic went away, the ad rates plummeted, because advertisers need you to be at a certain threshold of traffic before they will do the big ad deals with you. All that sponsored stuff went away, the money went away, and the company one day just called an all hands meeting, and at the meeting announced, all of you have been let go, except for they were leaving a skeleton crew of 5 people to try to keep it running. Everybody else was sent home. Shut down the video team, they let go of everybody. They closed the office, and it was just a few people working from home. And then I stuck around for 3 more years to try to keep it alive, and couldn't.
Right.
And so again, I found myself, at age 45, and this thing that I had spent 13 years building, I just watched it be picked apart and killed right in front of me, because all those people who I had talked into leaving their old jobs to come to Cracked, they were all laid off with very little severance, and they all lost their health insurance. And these people who I had convinced that, gosh, we get to work with David Wong, wow, this will be amazing. He's a genius. It's like, apparently not, because I didn't see this coming, and I could not figure out a way to make money doing what we were doing. And so everything I told myself about, our writing, it's important, it means something to people. I get their fan mail saying it changed their life, and they come here every day. The moment the nature of content changed, where they're viewing it on a phone, viewing it through Facebook's built-in browser, the moment they started to prefer their long form content in the form of audio instead of text, it just disappeared like smoke. And that was that. So I'm now writing books full time. I am incredibly fortunate to be able to do it. But I also have privilege. My wife has a good job. I get health insurance through her. If I had to pay health insurance out of pocket, it would be a huge bite out of my paycheck. I don't know that I would be able to do that. I would probably still have to find another day job.
This is the #1 place for macabrish, cults, classics, and horrors. For synopsis, reviews, and news, go to macabrish.com. Thank you for listening. Signing out until the next one.